Okay, let's be real for a sec. Who here hasn't stared down a to-do list that suddenly feels less like a list and more like, well, a monster hiding under the bed? Procrastination, right? We've all been there. But what if I told you there's way more to it than just bad habits? Today, we're diving deep into the why, the how, the what the heck is going on in my brain when it comes to procrastination. And trust me, it's way more interesting than you might think.
It really is fascinating stuff. We tend to blame ourselves, right? Like, oh, I'm just lazy or I have zero willpower. But the truth is, procrastination is actually rooted in some really basic human psychology.
And the research to back it up. We're diving into articles on the science behind it all, getting insights from the experts over at McLean Hospital, even looking at a surprising take on the potential upsides of procrastination from Honeybook. So yeah, buckle up. We're about to unravel the mysteries of procrastination and maybe, just maybe, make friends with that monster under the bed. But first things first, let's define the enemy, shall we? What exactly is procrastination, and why does it feel like it's basically a universal human experience?
Yeah, you're right. It's incredibly common. Studies have shown that something like 25% of adults actually identify as chronic procrastinators, so you are definitely not alone. But basically, it boils down to this. Procrastination is choosing short-term comfort over those long-term benefits. It's like knowing you should be diligently putting money aside for retirement, but then that fancy coffee drink is calling your name.
Okay, so it's not just me then. Whew. Actually, knowing that makes me feel a little bit better. But you said choosing comfort. Does that mean it's really all about just being lazy?
Not at all. Not at all. It's not about laziness, really. It's more about how our brains are wired.
Yeah.
Procrastination is actually deeply connected to this thing called discomfort intolerance. It's kind of like our brain pushing that big red panic button at even the slightest hint that something unpleasant is heading our way.
So instead of facing that wave of discomfort head on, like let's say finally starting that big project that's looming, our brains just desperately start searching for an escape route. Cue the siren song of social media.
Exactly. Our brains are hardwired to avoid pain and seek pleasure. It's survival instinct, right?
Yeah.
So when we're faced with a task that feels overwhelming or just boring or maybe even anxiety-inducing, our brains immediately start looking for an off-ramp. They start craving something instantly gratifying, an easy win. And unfortunately, in our modern world, let's be real, those distractions are everywhere.
It's like our brains are playing a never-ending game of would you rather.
Mm.
Would you rather power through these emails or scroll through your Instagram feed? Would you rather finally tackle that presentation or, maybe reorganize your sock drawer? And spoiler alert, instant gratification usually wins.
It so often does, yeah. And this is where this concept of subjective value comes into play. Our brains, they don't always choose what's actually best for us long term. They go for what feels the most rewarding right here, right now, in the moment.
Subjective value. So you're saying like how tempting or appealing something seems to us in the heat of the moment, even if, logically, we know it's not that important in the grand scheme of things. So suddenly, deep cleaning the bathroom sounds way more appealing than studying for that big exam next month, even though the exam really matters.
You got it. And that brings us to another piece of the procrastination puzzle, delayed discounting. Our brains have a surprisingly hard time really grasping and valuing rewards that are way off in the future. It's weird, but the further away a reward seems, the less appealing it is to our brains in this moment.
Wow. So it's not just that we're consciously choosing the easier, more fun task in the moment. It's that our brains are actually downplaying the importance of those bigger, more meaningful rewards that are further down the line. Okay, that actually explains a lot. But if it's all about our brain's wiring, does that mean we're stuck with this? Are we destined to be ruled by procrastination forever?
Not necessarily, no. Like you said, understanding these patterns is a huge first step, right? Like becoming aware of how our brains are working, even when they're working against us. That's got to help us change things, right?
But before we get into strategies for breaking free from procrastination, I really want to circle back to the mental health aspect of all of this. Because we touched on it briefly earlier, but it seems like there's a much deeper connection between procrastination and how we're doing mentally, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's not just like a one-way street either. Procrastination isn't just a symptom of some mental health conditions, although it can definitely be that, especially with things like anxiety, depression, ADHD. But it can also actually make these conditions even worse. So it really is a two-way street.
It's like this vicious cycle then, right? Like
Yeah.
your mental health makes you more likely to procrastinate, but then the procrastination just ends up making your mental health worse,
Yeah.
and on it goes.
Exactly. And it can be really hard to break free from that cycle once you're caught in it. For example, someone struggling with anxiety might avoid certain tasks because they're afraid of being judged or maybe failing, right? But then when they keep avoiding the task, they just end up feeling even more anxious about it?
And then someone with depression might just be completely drained,
Mhm.
right? Like their energy levels are so low, and it's a struggle to focus on anything. So actually even starting a task feels practically impossible.
Right, exactly. And that's why really understanding the nuances of those specific conditions is so important. Because, for instance, with ADHD, you often see these challenges with things like attention regulation, organization, just staying on track. It's really hard. And to someone on the outside, it might look like they're just being lazy or not even trying, but that's not what's going on at all.
So what looks like classic procrastination from the outside, like, oh, they're just being lazy, could actually be a sign that there's something much deeper going on internally. Like they're actually struggling with a real condition.
Exactly. And we haven't even talked about executive functioning yet, which plays a huge role in all of this. I mean, executive functioning, it's like the CEO of our brains, right? It's in charge of planning, organizing, starting, and finishing tasks. And when it's not working properly, well, procrastination can completely take over.
Wow. So it really is like that saying, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes,
Hmm.
because you truly never know what someone else is dealing with behind the scenes.
Exactly, exactly. And I think it's important to add that judging someone for procrastinating is almost never helpful and honestly pretty unfair most of the time. It's really about understanding, not placing blame.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. But speaking of understanding, I'm curious, is there ever a time when procrastination maybe isn't such a bad thing after all? And we've all heard those stories, right? Like someone's struggling with a problem for days, maybe even weeks, and then they finally step away, do something else for a while, and bam, the solution just hits them out of the blue.
You're so right, and you actually stumbled upon a really fascinating concept. It's called, wait for it, productive procrastination.
Productive procrastination.
Uh,
Okay, that sounds like an oxymoron if I've ever heard one.
Right. It does sound a little counterintuitive, but there's a whole school of thought that suggests that sometimes short-term procrastination can actually be a really useful tool. It can help us prioritize what really matters, and it can even boost our creativity. There's this great example, Salvador Dali, the surrealist painter.
Oh yeah, the melting clocks.
Yes. Him, well, he was famous for using something called, get this, hypnagogic states to generate new creative ideas.
Hypnagogic states.
Yeah, it's basically that state between being awake and being asleep when you're kind of drifting off. And what Dolly would do is he'd let himself drift off like that while holding an object, anything really. And then when he'd fall asleep for real, the object would fall from his hand, make a noise, and jolt him awake.
Clever.
Right. But the best part is he'd often wake up with these brilliant brand new ideas.
Wow, so he was actually like intentionally using procrastination, or at least a form of it, to help him be more creative.
Exactly. And it really speaks to this idea that sometimes the best thing we can do when we're feeling stuck is to just step away from the problem for a bit. Because when we do that, even if we're just doing something else that seems totally unrelated, it gives our subconscious mind a chance to kind of work on the problem in the background.
Okay, so you're saying like all those times when I'm reorganizing my desk, instead of writing that report that's due, my brain might actually be back there behind the scenes, making connections and coming up with solutions without me even realizing it.
It's totally possible. When we step back and give our minds a break, they can actually be more productive sometimes. They can make new connections, they can see things from a different angle, and that can lead to those aha moments, like when you're in the shower, you're out for a walk, and the answer just pops into your head.
I love those moments. But I'm guessing this whole productive procrastination thing, it doesn't apply to all types of procrastination, right?
You are correct. It's really important to distinguish between, let's call it strategic procrastination, the short-term kind, and then chronic procrastination, which is more of a pattern. Think of it this way. Strategic procrastination is like saying, okay, I need a break. I'm going to come back to this with fresh eyes. But then chronic procrastination is more like, ugh, I'm so overwhelmed, I don't even know where to start. I'm just going to avoid this whole thing altogether.
So it's really about being honest with ourselves,
Right.
right? Like recognizing when we're making a deliberate choice to step away, a strategic pause to reset, versus when we're just avoiding something, because those deeper psychological mechanisms we talked about earlier, those are kicking in.
Exactly. And, just knowing all of this, it's a great first step. But I bet our listeners are eager to hear about how to actually break out of this procrastination cycle, how to actually get things done.
Absolutely. Because understanding is one thing, but how do we translate that understanding into action? Let's talk strategies. So we've talked about why we procrastinate, the mental gymnastics, the sneaky brain tricks. But the big question is, how do we actually break free? How do we escape the procrastination vortex and finally start checking things off that to-do list?
You know, it might sound a little too simple, but one of the most effective strategies is actually one of the most straightforward. Just start.
Oh, if only it were that easy,
Yeah.
right? Easier said than done, especially when you're facing a task that's about as appealing as a root canal.
Oh, absolutely. I feel that. But here's the interesting thing. Often, action actually comes before motivation. Just the act of starting, even if it's just for a few minutes, just dipping your toes in, that can be enough to break through that initial resistance, that feeling of, ugh, and get the ball rolling.
So are you saying it's like tricking your brain a little, making it think, oh, this isn't such a big deal after all?
Exactly. Like, set a timer for, say, 15 minutes and just tell yourself, okay, I'm only going to work on this for 15 minutes, then I can stop.
No.
You might be surprised by how much you actually get done once you overcome that initial hurdle, that initial resistance.
Okay, so we've tackled the starting line, the getting going part. But what about when the task itself is just daunting? Like even thinking about it makes you want to crawl back in bed.
This is where a little bit of good old-fashioned organization and some smart time management can work wonders.
Oh, you mean like to-do lists, calendars, that kind of stuff?
Exactly. Those tools can be lifesavers because they help you break down these bigger, scarier tasks into smaller, much more manageable chunks.
Makes it seem a little less intimidating that way, right?
Yeah.
Like outsmarting those procrastination gremlins in our brain.
Yes, exactly. And remember those psychological principles we talked about earlier. Subjective value, delay discounting.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, when you break a task down like that, you're actually, without realizing it, bringing that reward closer. You're making the effort seem smaller, more doable. You're basically hacking your brain's reward system.
I am loving these brain hacks. This is great stuff. But even with the best organization, the color-coded calendars, the perfectly arranged to-do list, sometimes motivation can still be a struggle. Any tips for those times when you're just feeling stuck, lacking that get-up-and-go energy?
Absolutely. One thing that can really help is connecting the task to your values, to your bigger goals. So instead of thinking, ugh, I have to finish this report, it's so boring, try shifting your perspective. Ask yourself, why is this report important? How does it connect to my long-term goals?
So instead of, oh, I have to do this, it's more like, this is a stepping stone to getting where I want to be.
Exactly. When you can see the bigger picture, how that task, even if it seems small or tedious, fits into something bigger, it instantly becomes more meaningful, more motivating.
It's like giving yourself a pep talk,
Yeah.
reminding yourself why you're doing it in the first place.
Exactly.
Mm.
And never underestimate the power of a little reward. Give yourself something to look forward to once you've finished a task, even if it's just something small. A little celebration never hurt anyone, right?
It really doesn't. Speaking of celebrations, we have covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the why, the how, even some surprising benefits of procrastination. Who knew? But before we wrap up, I want to touch on something really important, and that's the idea of seeking support. Because for some people, procrastination, it's more than just a quirky habit, right? It's a really deeply ingrained pattern, and sometimes it might actually require a little extra help to overcome.
I completely agree. If you feel like procrastination is consistently getting in the way of you living your best life, if it's causing you a lot of stress or maybe even affecting your relationships, your work, your responsibilities, it's so important to reach out to a mental health professional.
And there's absolutely no shame in that. It actually takes a lot of strength and self-awareness to recognize when you need a little extra help. And luckily, there are so many great resources out there. Therapy can be incredibly helpful, and there's coaching, even medication if that's appropriate.
Absolutely. And within therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, has been shown to be really effective for dealing with procrastination specifically, because CBT can help you identify those negative thought patterns that are often fueling the procrastination, and then it gives you tools to challenge those thoughts and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
That's so good to hear. So if you're listening to this and relating to any of this, if you're feeling overwhelmed by your own procrastination habits, just remember, you are definitely not alone. Procrastination is a human experience. It's not a character flaw, it's not a sign of weakness, and by understanding the psychology behind it, by learning some new strategies, by being kind to ourselves throughout the process, we can all break free from that procrastination cycle and start achieving those goals, those dreams, those things we've been putting off.
And sometimes those goals, they might just involve giving yourself permission to rest, to recharge, because not all procrastination is inherently bad, right? It's
Yeah.
about finding that balance, finding what works for you, and creating a life that feels both meaningful and sustainable.
So well said. And on that note, I think I might just go ahead and procrastinate on doing those dishes tonight. But seriously, listeners, I'm really curious. If you could eliminate that fear of failure, even for just one day, what's the first thing you would tackle on your to-do list? Let us know. Until next time, happy productivity.